Rafah, a 64 square kilometer stretch of land in the south of Palestine's Gaza, bordered by Egypt to the southwest, Israeli kibbutzim to the southeast, the Mediterranean Sea to the west, and the rest of Gaza to the northeast. Since Israel launched its brutal onslaught on the besieged enclave on October 7, Tel Aviv forced more than 1 million Palestinians to evacuate the north of Gaza to the southern governorate, claiming it was a safe zone for civilians. But is Rafah actually safe? Not really. Rafah is Israel's next target for a major ground invasion. Despite international warnings and condemnation, Tel Aviv already ramped up its attacks on the now overcrowded governorate, killing more than a dozen Palestinians seeking refuge there each day. The fear of being forcibly displaced once again is looming like a heavy weight over Gaza's inhabitants. But why is Israel adamant about invading Rafah? What is Israel's plan? What would it mean for Palestinians in Rafah? And what is at stake for the US and Egypt? Many experts say that Israel is carrying out a new Nakba in Gaza and that its ongoing offensive is a ploy to reoccupy the Palestinian territory. So far, Tel Aviv has leveled more than 70% of Gaza's infrastructure and displaced around 1.7 million of the enclave's inhabitants, effectively creating a fertile ground for reoccupation. Several right-wing Israeli groups have even begun advancing plans to develop real estate in Gaza. And while Israeli forces have not seized full control of the north, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is hell-bent on expanding his ground offensive into Rafah, where he claims Hamas has its last base with 4 war-ready battalions stationed there. Analysts say that Israel's proclaimed goals of ending Hamas and freeing the Israeli hostages seem far from reach. Hamas fighters are still operating both in the north and the south of the enclave and still have more than 100 Israeli hostages in their custody. This is causing mounting frustrations among anti-Netanyahu protesters, who have been demanding a ceasefire agreement and that all Israeli hostages be released. Thus, a nominal victory in Rafah is all the more important for Tel Aviv to legitimize its war. But invading Rafah would mean mobilizing Israeli soldiers at the Egyptian border and violating the Camp David Accords that were signed around 4 decades ago between Israel and Egypt. The accords state that Israel's military force cannot exceed more than 4 battalions within 3 kilometers east of the international border. If more battalions are deployed, Israel would be risking escalating its war to include a front against Egypt and souring relations with one of its closest allies, the broker of the Camp David Accords and the prime funder of Israel's onslaught on Gaza, the US. But how likely is an Israeli war front with Egypt? Cairo, one of the top 20 military forces in the world, has warned Tel Aviv that invading Rafah would have consequences. According to officials, it has already stationed 40 tanks and armored personnel carriers in the Sinai Peninsula and has asked for additional aid from the US to secure its borders against a potential Israeli attack. But would Egypt really risk starting a war with Israel? Cairo has been receiving more than $1 billion worth of annual aid from the US since signing the Camp David Accords. Experts say that violating the accords could deprive Egypt of these funds and put extra pressure on its economy. If Israel seizes control of Rafah, Egypt would lose an important buffer between its borders and Israel. This would pose a great security threat for the country, especially the Sinai Peninsula, which was continuously targeted by Israel before the Camp David peace treaty. Additionally, if Israel were to bomb Rafah or push displaced Palestinians further towards Egypt, the influx of refugees could have dire economic consequences on Cairo. Reports have surfaced of Egyptian efforts to fortify and reinforce the Egyptian border walls with Gaza to prevent a potential refugee influx. So amid all this, what is at stake for the US? The US's interests in the Middle East require protecting the status quo. If any war were to erupt with Israel, the US would have to intervene in Israel's favor. And that's according to President Joe Biden, who in 1986 said,
"Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region."
The US has already allocated billions of dollars in military equipment and aid to Israel for its war on Palestinians. But this allegiance is not without consequences. Since October 7, protesters have been putting increasing pressure on the US government to sever ties with Israel. Experts say this growing discontent could affect the upcoming presidential election results in November. But what does all this mean for Palestinians? The UN has warned of a slaughter if Tel Aviv were to invade Rafah. If successful in taking over the governorate and displacing its population, Israel would tighten its siege on Palestinians in the enclave, robbing them of 2 more border crossings and lifelines, the Kerem Shalom and Rafah crossings, through which people and thousands of aid trucks used to pass before October 7. While Israeli settlers are currently holding up aid at the Kerem Shalom crossing, Israel has claimed that tunnels bypassing the Rafah crossing were home to a main weapon smuggling route between Sinai and Gaza and had to be secured. But Egypt has denied that claim, affirming that it had neutralized all tunnels leading from and to Gaza. Cairo says that these Israeli lies are an attempt to legitimize a potential Israeli occupation of the Philadelphia Corridor or Salatin Axis, referring to a 14-kilometer strip at the Egyptian-Palestinian borders. A report leaked in November has exposed Israeli plans to replace Hamas with the Palestinian Authority or local leaders, or expel Palestinians in Gaza to tent cities in Sinai. But Egypt has been resolute in rejecting the latter option and has consistently warned of repercussions if Tel Aviv attempts it. Alternatively, Israel has proposed setting up 15 refugee camps by the sea, running from the southern edge of Gaza City down to the Al-Mawasi area north of Rafah, which is also unsafe amid Israeli attacks and already overcrowded. Netanyahu has also considered sending Palestinians back to the north of the enclave, where Israeli forces are still stationed. In Netanyahu's words,
people down, they can move back up.
Meanwhile, the US has proposed avoiding a large-scale offensive and deploying specialized, more precise troops for Israel's prospective assault. But this could further prolong the war, putting extra pressure on the Israeli economy and increase internal pressure on the government and on Netanyahu, who faces 3 ongoing corruption trials. Between Israel's expansionist and colonialist campaigns, the individual interests of several players involved, and the failure of international bodies to rein Israel in, more than 33,000 Palestinians have been killed. If the raid on Rafah is successful, how long will the war rage on? How many more lives will be lost?